Omar Al-Farid stood at the expansive balcony of his family's palace. The warm glow of the desert sunset bathing the opulent city below. His father's empire stretched beyond the glittering skyline, reaching deep into the oil-rich sands of their ancestors. Yet, despite the wealth and influence woven into his name, Omar couldn't shake the restlessness that churned inside him. The weight of expectation was a constant presence. As the sole male heir of the Al-Farid dynasty, he was groomed to lead their business empire, a task that demanded loyalty to both tradition and family. For Omar, who had spent years abroad pursuing education and ideas his father considered Western indulgences, the path ahead felt less like a destiny and more like a gilded cage. Omar, his father's deep, commanding voice echoed through the marble hall. Sheikh Abdul Al-Farid, the patriarch of the family, exuded authority in every gesture. Even now, in his 70s, his sharp eyes carried the weight of decades of leadership. "Yes, father." Omar turned, already bracing for the conversation that was about to unfold. "There's a matter requiring your immediate attention," Sheikh Abdul began. "A foreign archaeologist is conducting excavations on our land near the southern border. She claims to have government permits, but this intrusion is intolerable. You will go there tomorrow and shut it down." Omar hesitated. He had read reports about the excavation, a promising discovery of artifacts that could date back centuries. He felt a twinge of curiosity, but his father's tone left little room for negotiation. "Do you understand?" the sheikh pressed. "Yes, father," Omar replied, his voice steady. "I'll handle it." That night, as the city lights twinkled below, Omar sat alone in his study. The reports on the excavation lay open before him, but his mind wandered. His life, though filled with privilege, felt devoid of meaning. Perhaps this task, however mundane, could offer a glimpse of something beyond his carefully controlled world. The next morning, Omar's convoy crossed the golden expanse of the desert, the city skyline shrinking behind him. The rhythmic hum of the engine matched his contemplative mood. When they arrived at the excavation site, a striking contrast awaited him. The tents and makeshift equipment stood against the backdrop of ancient ruins, their weathered stones whispering stories of forgotten times. "Can I help you?" a woman's voice called out. Omar turned to see her, a figure clad in dusty work clothes, her auburn hair tied back under a scarf. Her eyes, bright and determined, sized him up without hesitation. "I'm Omar Al-Farid," he said, his tone measured. "This land belongs to my family. You must cease operations immediately." The woman didn't flinch. "I'm Sophia Carter," she replied, her voice firm but polite, "and we have full authorization from the government. I assure you, we're here to preserve history, not disrupt it." Omar frowned. This wasn't the reaction he had anticipated. "The land may be ancient, but it is ours. My family has the right to decide what happens here." Sophia crossed her arms. "And you think history cares about ownership? These artifacts could redefine what we know about this region." Their exchange carried a tension that neither could fully articulate. For Omar, her defiance was both infuriating and oddly intriguing. Sophia, on the other hand, sensed an internal conflict in him, a man torn between his duty and something deeper. As they spoke, a member of Sophia's team approached, holding a small box. "Dr. Carter, we found something." Sophia opened the box to reveal an intricate gold pendant, its design unlike anything Omar had seen before. The artifact glimmered in the sunlight, its delicate craftsmanship hinting at a story lost to time. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Sophia said, almost to herself. This could be from the early trading routes that passed through this region, a symbol of connection between cultures. Omar felt a strange pull toward the pendant. "And yet, it's buried here, forgotten." Sophia glanced at him, sensing the layers beneath his words. "That's why we're here, to uncover what's been lost and honor it." Their conversation ended abruptly as the wind began to pick up, swirling sand into the air. Omar watched as Sophia carefully stored the pendant, her focus unwavering. There was a determination in her that he couldn't ignore. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Omar returned to his car, the pendant's image lingering in his mind. This land, these ruins, they held stories far older than his family's empire. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of curiosity that defied the rigid expectations placed upon him. When he arrived back at the palace, his father was waiting. "It's done, I assume?" the sheik asked. "Not yet," Omar replied carefully. "The situation is more complex than it seems." Sheikh Abdul's gaze hardened. "There is no complexity, Omar. This land is ours, and our will must prevail." Omar nodded but remained silent. For the first time, he realized he wasn't ready to blindly follow orders. Something about the excavation and the woman leading it was stirring questions he could no longer ignore. Omar returned to the excavation site the next morning, driven by an unshakable need to understand what Sophia Carter and her team were uncovering. The early light cast long shadows over the ruins, and the air carried a crisp coolness that would soon yield to the desert heat. He stepped out of his car, his polished shoes crunching on the gritty sand, and immediately spotted Sophia crouched by one of the excavation pits. She was studying a fragment of pottery, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Back so soon?" she said without looking up, her voice laced with dry amusement. "I thought you'd already decided to shut us down." "I came to reassess the situation," Omar replied, straightening his posture. "My family values preservation, but we must balance it with our priorities." Sophia finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Your family's priorities seem to lean heavily toward control, not preservation." The words stung, but Omar kept his composure. "And you seem quick to judge without knowing me." She set the pottery aside and stood, brushing the dust off her hands. "Maybe, but actions speak louder than words, mister." Alfred. Before he could respond, a member of her team approached, cradling a small artifact wrapped in cloth. "Dr. Carter, we found another piece near the eastern section." Sophia took the artifact carefully, unwrapping it to reveal a delicate bracelet. Its design intricately patterned with symbols Omar didn't recognize. Her face lit up with excitement, and for a moment, her professional demeanor softened into something more personal. "This is incredible," she murmured, almost to herself. "It matches the pendant we found yesterday. They must have belonged to the same person." Omar moved closer, drawn by the beauty of the piece. The bracelet's craftsmanship was exquisite, its symbol seemingly alive under the sunlight. "What do these markings mean?" he asked. "We're not sure yet," Sophia admitted, her tone still reverent. "But this level of artistry suggests a significant cultural exchange. It's possible this belonged to someone of high status, maybe even royalty." "Royalty," Omar echoed, his gaze lingering on the bracelet. "And now it's buried in the sands, forgotten." Sophia looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "That's why we're here, to remember." The simplicity of her statement struck him, and for a brief moment, the air between them shifted. Omar saw not just a woman defying his family's authority, but someone driven by a purpose larger than herself. He felt a strange pull toward her, a mixture of admiration and unease. The spell was broken when one of the excavation workers called out from across the site, and Sophia excused herself to investigate. Left alone, Omar wandered closer to the ruins, his polished image at odds with the ancient stones around him. He traced his fingers along the weathered surface of a wall, feeling its roughness, its age. This place carried a weight he couldn't ignore, a sense of history that both humbled and intrigued him. When Sophia returned, she found him standing near one of the pits, his expression unusually contemplative. "You seem different from the man who came here yesterday," she said. Omar turned to her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Perhaps I'm beginning to see the value in what you're doing here." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Does that mean you'll convince your family to let us continue?" "Not yet," he replied, the smile fading. "But I'll need more than sentiment to make my case. Show me why this excavation matters, not just to history, but to us today." Sophia studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right, but you'll have to get your hands dirty." Omar hesitated, glancing at his meticulously tailored suit, then back at her. "I suppose I could make an exception." By the time the sun reached its peak, Omar found himself kneeling beside Sophia. carefully brushing away sand to reveal what appeared to be part of an ornate vase. His initial reluctance had given way to genuine curiosity, though he would never admit how much he enjoyed the work. Sophia guided him patiently, her explanations weaving a narrative of a people long gone but not forgotten. As the day wore on, Omar began to notice small details about her, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about the artifacts, the passion in her voice when she described their historical significance. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, unyielding in her convictions, and grounded in a sense of purpose that he found both frustrating and admirable. When they finally took a break, sitting under the shade of a large tent, Sophia handed him a bottle of water. "So, does your family know you're playing archaeologist today?" Omar chuckled softly. "If they did, I'm certain my father would call this a betrayal of our values." "Maybe it is," she said, her tone lighter than before. "But sometimes betrayal is necessary to build something better." Her words lingered in his mind as they sat in companionable silence, the vastness of the desert stretching out before them. For the first time in a long while, Omar felt a sense of peace, though he knew it wouldn't last. His family's expectations were a shadow that loomed too large to ignore, and this newfound connection with Sophia only complicated matters. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the site, Omar prepared to leave. "Thank you for today," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "You've given me a lot to think about." Sophia smiled faintly. "Don't thank me yet. The hard part's still ahead." He nodded, knowing she was right. As he climbed into his car, the bracelet and its intricate symbols flashed through his mind, a reminder of the stories buried beneath the surface. Stories that, much like his own, demanded to be unearthed. The sound of Omar's footsteps echoed through the grand marble halls of the palace as he made his way to the main sitting room. The towering arched windows flooded the space with light, reflecting off the intricate gold patterns that adorned the walls. His father, Sheikh Abdul Al-Farid, sat in the center of the room, flanked by family advisors and business associates. The tension in the air was palpable. "You've been spending a great deal of time at the excavation," the Sheikh began, his voice calm but loaded with implication. "Tell me, Omar, have you come to a decision?" Omar straightened his shoulders, meeting his father's piercing gaze. "The situation is more nuanced than we initially thought. The artifacts being uncovered are significant, not just historically, but culturally." "Culturally?" the Sheikh repeated, his tone sharp. "Our culture is rooted in strength, in preserving our heritage, not in appeasing foreign archaeologists." "It's not about appeasement," Omar countered. "This excavation has the potential to shed light on our ancestors' connections with the broader world. Isn't that worth preserving?" The advisors exchanged uneasy glances, but the Sheikh remained unmoved. "And what do you propose we gain from this? More foreign interference? More scrutiny of our lands? These discoveries will only invite trouble." Omar clenched his fists at his sides, forcing himself to remain composed. "Respectfully, Father, I believe this is an opportunity to shape the narrative about our history. It's not just about the past, it's about who we are now." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Finally, the Sheikh stood, his commanding presence silencing any murmurs. "You are speaking as though you've already taken a side. Remember your place, Omar. You are not a historian. You are the heir to this family, and your duty is to protect what is ours." Omar nodded stiffly, his heart sinking under the weight of his father's expectations. "I understand." As the meeting adjourned, Omar felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see his sister, Amira, her expression a mixture of sympathy and worry. Amira had always been his confidant, the one person who understood the pressures he faced. "You're walking a dangerous line," she said quietly as they left the room. "Father won't tolerate defiance for long." "I'm not trying to defy him," Omar replied, his voice heavy with frustration. "But there's more at stake here than he's willing to see." Amira nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "You've always been the idealist. It's one of your best qualities, but it's also what makes you vulnerable. They entered one of the palace's private courtyards, where the sound of a trickling fountain offered a brief respite from the tension inside. Omar sank onto a bench, running a hand through his hair. "What would you have me do, Amira? Pretend this doesn't matter? Walk away and let it all be buried again?" She sat beside him, her tone soft but firm. "No, but you need to be careful. Father's idea of loyalty is rigid. If he thinks you're challenging his authority, he won't hesitate to remind you of your place." Omar sighed, the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him. "I just want to do what's right, Amira. For the family, for the land, for myself." "And what about her?" Amira asked gently, the archaeologist. "She seems important to you." Omar hesitated, caught off guard by her question. Images of Sophia flashed through his mind, her determination, her passion, the way she spoke about the artifacts as if they were alive. "She's different," he admitted. "She sees things in a way I hadn't considered before." Amira gave him a knowing look. "Be honest with yourself, Omar. Is this about the excavation, or is it about her?" Before he could respond, a servant appeared, bowing politely. "Sheikh Omar, your father requests your presence in his study." Omar rose reluctantly, glancing back at Amira. "Whatever this is about, promise me you'll be careful," she said. He nodded, her words echoing in his mind as he made his way to the study. The Sheikh's private office was a space that radiated power and tradition. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with texts on business, history, and religion. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, and behind it, the Sheikh sat with an air of quiet authority. "You wanted to see me?" Omar asked, keeping his tone respectful. The Sheikh gestured for him to sit. "I have received word that you've been assisting the archaeologists at the excavation." Omar's jaw tightened. "I've been observing their work, yes." "Observing?" The Sheikh's voice carried an edge. "You've been associating with outsiders, defying my orders. This is not the behavior of a future leader." "Father, I'm trying to understand the situation fully before making a decision," Omar replied, his frustration barely contained. "Isn't that what leadership requires?" "Leadership requires loyalty," the Sheikh snapped. "To your family, to our heritage. You speak as though you've forgotten that." Omar stood, his voice firm. "I haven't forgotten. But preserving our heritage means more than just protecting what we own. It means honoring the past, even when it challenges us." The Sheikh rose as well, his presence towering. "Be careful, Omar. Your words tread dangerously close to rebellion." Omar held his father's gaze, a storm of emotions swirling inside him. Finally, he nodded and left the room, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud. Later that evening, Omar sat alone in his study, staring at the bracelet Sophia had shown him earlier that day. The intricate symbols seemed to hold secrets he couldn't yet grasp, their beauty a reminder of the complexity of the world beyond his family's rules. For the first time, he wondered if the cost of loyalty was too high a price to pay. The next morning, the sun rose over the desert with a quiet intensity, the air already heavy with heat. Omar arrived at the excavation site earlier than expected, his presence catching Sophia off guard. She stood by the edge of a shallow pit, her hands resting on her hips as she surveyed the work being done. At the sight of him, she raised an eyebrow, a mixture of curiosity and irritation flashing across her face. "Back again, Mr. Alfred?" she asked, her voice laced with a touch of sarcasm. "What brings you to our humble ruins today?" Omar smiled faintly, sensing the challenge in her tone. "You asked me to see the value in what you're doing here. I decided to take you up on that offer." Sophia studied him for a moment, as if trying to discern whether his words were genuine. Finally, she nodded and gestured for him to follow. "Well, if you're serious, we can use an extra pair of hands, but don't expect any special treatment." "Noted," Omar replied, his amusement evident. She led him to an area where several team members were, carefully brushing away sand to reveal fragments of pottery embedded in the earth. Omar watched as they worked with meticulous precision, their tools delicate but effective. It was a far cry from the fast-paced, high-stakes decisions he was accustomed to in the world of business. Here, every movement was intentional, every detail considered. Sophia handed him a brush and knelt beside him, demonstrating the technique. "It's all about patience," she explained. "You can't rush the process, or you risk damaging what you're trying to uncover." Omar mimicked her movements, his initial awkwardness giving way to a surprising ease. As they worked side by side, he found himself drawn into the rhythm of the task, the repetitive motion oddly calming. For a while, neither of them spoke, the quiet filled only by the sound of brushes against sand and the distant murmur of other workers. Finally, Sophia broke the silence. "You don't seem like the kind of man who's used to slowing down." Omar glanced at her, a wry smile on his lips. "And you don't seem like the kind of woman who tolerates interruptions." She chuckled softly, her guard dropping for just a moment. "Fair enough. So, what's your story, Omar Al-Farid? Why does the heir to a fortune care about an excavation in the middle of the desert?" The question caught him off guard. He hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Let's just say I've been questioning a lot lately. What it means to honor tradition, to lead, to make choices that matter." Sophia tilted her head, her gaze thoughtful. "And you think you'll find answers here?" "Maybe," Omar admitted. "Or maybe I just needed to see something different. Something real." Her expression softened, and for the first time, she seemed to regard him not as an adversary, but as an equal. "You might be surprised what you can find when you dig deep enough." They continued working, the hours slipping by unnoticed. Sophia showed him how to catalog fragments, explaining their significance with an enthusiasm that was contagious. Omar found himself listening intently, drawn not just to her words, but to the passion behind them. She had a way of making the past feel alive, as though each artifact held a story waiting to be told. As the afternoon wore on, the desert heat intensified, and the team retreated to the shade of the tents for a break. Sophia handed Omar a bottle of water, her own face flushed from the sun. "Not bad for your first day," she said, a hint of teasing in her tone. "I'm glad I passed the test," Omar replied, taking a sip. "Although I'm not sure how much I actually contributed." "It's not about how much you find," she said. "It's about the process. Every small piece fits into a larger picture." Omar considered her words, the metaphor not lost on him. "Do you always look at things that way?" She shrugged, a faint smile playing at her lips. "I guess I've always been drawn to puzzles, figuring out how the pieces fit together. Why people did what they did, what they left behind. And what about the pieces that don't fit?" Omar asked, his tone more serious. Sophia's smile faded slightly, and she looked away, her gaze distant. "Sometimes you just have to accept that not everything has an answer." The weight of her response hung between them, unspoken but understood. Omar wondered what pieces of her own story she kept buried, what unanswered questions haunted her. But before he could ask, one of the workers called for her, and she excused herself to tend to the site. Left alone, Omar wandered to the edge of the excavation, the vastness of the desert stretching out before him. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of stillness, as though the noise of his life had been stripped away, leaving only the essentials. He thought of his father's words, his sister's warnings, and the choices that lay ahead. The weight of it all seemed to pale in comparison to the simplicity of this moment. When Sophia returned, she found him standing there, his expression contemplative. "You're a hard man to read, Omar Al-Farid." He turned to her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe I'm just trying to figure myself out." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Well, you're welcome to keep trying. Just don't forget, this isn't about you." Her words were a gentle reminder, but they carried an edge that Omar couldn't ignore. He nodded, the truth of her statement settling deep within him. This was bigger than him, bigger than his family. It was about something timeless, something worth preserving. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the desert in hues of orange and gold, Omar prepared to leave. Sophia walked with him to his car, her presence steady and grounding. "Thank you for today," he said quietly. "I learned more than I expected." Sophia smiled faintly, her eyes meeting his. "Maybe there's hope for you yet." He chuckled softly, but the moment carried an unspoken understanding between them. connection that neither could fully define, but both felt deeply. As he drove away, the ruins faded into the distance, but the impact of the day stayed with him. For the first time in a long while, Omar felt a spark of purpose, though he knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. By the time Omar returned to the palace, the sun had fully set, leaving the city bathed in the glow of artificial lights. The atmosphere inside the Alfarid estate was far from tranquil. Whispers trailed him as he passed servants and staff, their stolen glances filled with curiosity. Omar didn't need to ask why. News traveled fast, especially in a family as prominent as his. He entered the dining hall to find his father and sister already seated. The sheik's face was a mask of calm authority, but his eyes betrayed the storm brewing beneath. Amira, on the other hand, looked at Omar with a mixture of concern and quiet warning. "You've been busy," the sheik began, his voice measured but sharp. "I hear you've taken quite an interest in the excavation." Omar stiffened, his father's tone confirming his suspicions. "I've been observing their work. It's important to understand what's happening on our land." "Understanding is one thing," the sheik replied, his voice rising slightly, "but your actions have drawn attention. People are asking questions. Why is the heir to the Alfarid fortune fraternizing with foreigners and meddling in matters that are beneath him?" Omar's jaw tightened. "These aren't just foreigners, father. They're experts uncovering pieces of our history. Isn't that worth our attention?" "Attention is a luxury we cannot afford," the sheik snapped. "Every move you make reflects on this family. You risk tarnishing our reputation with these indulgences." Amira's voice cut through the tension, soft but firm. Perhaps Omar's intentions are being misunderstood. There's value in showing that our family supports cultural preservation. The sheik's glare shifted to her, but her calm demeanor remained unshaken. "This is not about cultural preservation, Amira. This is about control. We cannot let others dictate what happens on our land." Omar took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain composed. "I'm not letting anyone dictate anything. I'm trying to find a balance between protecting our heritage and embracing its significance." The sheik leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Be careful, Omar. The world is watching, and they are eager to see us falter." Later that evening, Omar retreated to his study, seeking solace in the quiet. He sat at his desk, absent-mindedly flipping through a book on ancient trade routes. The words blurred as his mind replayed the conversation with his father. His family's reputation had always been a shield, but now it felt like a cage. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, expecting Amira. Instead, one of the family's advisors stepped in, his demeanor formal but uneasy. "Sheikh Omar," the man began, "I've been made aware of rumors circulating in the city." Omar arched an eyebrow. "Rumors?" "Yes, about your involvement with the excavation. There are whispers of a relationship between you and the foreign archaeologist." The words hit him like a jolt, his mind racing to process the implications. "That's absurd," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I've only been observing their work." The advisor hesitated. "Even so, perception can be as damaging as truth. These rumors could be weaponized against you and your family." Omar dismissed him with a curt nod, but the unease lingered. He couldn't deny the connection he felt with Sophia, even if it was still undefined. The thought of their interactions being reduced to gossip left a bitter taste in his mouth. The following day, Omar arrived at the excavation site earlier than usual, his thoughts clouded with frustration. He found Sophia kneeling by one of the pits, her focus entirely on the artifact she was unearthing. She looked up as he approached, her expression shifting to concern when she saw his face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, standing and dusting off her hands. Omar hesitated, unsure how to begin. "There are rumors circulating about us," he said finally. "They're saying we're involved." Sophia's brow furrowed. "Rumors? From who?" "It doesn't matter," Omar replied, his tone clipped. "What matters is that people are watching, and they'll use anything they can to discredit you or me." Sophia crossed her arms, her frustration evident. "And what are you suggesting we do about it? Pretend there's nothing here? Pretend you don't care? Omar faltered, caught off guard by her directness. I'm not suggesting that, he said carefully. I'm just trying to protect both of us. Sophia shook her head, her voice softened. I understand the pressure you're under, Omar. But if you start letting rumors dictate your actions, you'll lose sight of why you're here in the first place. The words struck a chord, and for a moment, the tension between them eased. Omar nodded, the weight of his responsibilities momentarily lifting. You're right. I just need to focus on what matters. And what matters, Sophia said, her tone firm, is this excavation, not what people are saying about us. The day passed in relative quiet, but the undercurrent of unease remained. Omar threw himself into the work, his hands growing steadier with each artifact he uncovered. Sophia guided him with patience, her presence grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat together under the shade of a large tent. The desert breeze carried a hint of coolness, a welcome relief after the day's heat. For the first time, Omar allowed himself to relax, his walls lowering just enough to let her in. Do you ever regret this? He asked suddenly. The sacrifices you've made to be here? Sophia looked at him, her expression thoughtful. There are moments when it's hard, when I miss home, when I question whether I'm making a difference. But then I remember why I'm here. These artifacts, these stories, they deserve to be told. Omar nodded, her conviction resonating with him. I envy that clarity, he admitted. I've spent so much of my life trying to meet expectations that I've forgotten what it feels like to want something for myself. Sophia smiled faintly. Maybe it's time you start asking yourself what you really want. As they sat there, the weight of the rumors and the expectations faded into the background. For now, they were just two people connected by a shared purpose, trying to make sense of a world that seemed determined to pull them apart. The tension between Omar and his father came to a boiling point the next evening. Dinner at the palace was a formal affair, as always, with lavishly prepared dishes served under glittering chandeliers. Yet the atmosphere was far from celebratory. Omar's father sat at the head of the long table, his gaze fixed on his son with a mixture of disappointment and authority. You're becoming a subject of whispers, the sheik said, breaking the silence. His voice was measured, but carried a sharp undertone. This family cannot afford to be the center of scandal, Omar. Omar set down his fork, his appetite long gone. The excavation isn't a scandal. It's an opportunity to preserve our history. Is it preservation you care about? The sheik snapped, or the archaeologist leaned. The accusation landed like a hammer. Omar clenched his jaw, refusing to meet his father's gaze. Sophia is dedicated to her work. She's not a threat to our family. She's a distraction, the sheik countered, his voice rising. And you are forgetting your duty. There is no place for sentimentality in leadership. Amira, sitting silently beside Omar, shifted uncomfortably but didn't intervene. Her usual quiet support was a lifeline, but even she seemed hesitant to challenge their father tonight. She's not a distraction, Omar said firmly. And if anyone is tarnishing our name, it's not Sophia. It's us, for turning our backs on something meaningful. The sheik stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. You speak as though you have a choice. Let me remind you, Omar, everything you have, everything you are, is because of this family. You will do what is expected of you, or you will lose it all. The words hung heavy in the air. Omar's chest tightened, but he refused to back down. If protecting our heritage means losing what I have, then so be it. The room fell into stunned silence. Amir's eyes widened, and for a moment, even the sheik seemed caught off guard. But the moment passed quickly, and the patriarch's face hardened. Without another word, he turned and left the room, his robes billowing behind him. Omar sat in silence, his hands clenched into fists. Amira reached out, placing a hand on his arm. You need to be careful, she said softly. Father doesn't make empty threats. I know, Omar replied, his voice quieter now. But I can't keep living like this, Amira. I'm tired of being a puppet. She nodded, her expression tinged with next move. Later that night, Omar found himself wandering the palace gardens. The cool night air, a welcome reprieve from the suffocating tension inside. The stars above were bright, their light casting faint shadows over the manicured paths. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice Amira following him until she spoke. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Omar turned to face her, his expression resolute. "I don't know where this will lead, but yes, I can't keep ignoring what feels right." Amira studied him for a moment, then sighed. "If you're going to do this, you need to be ready to face the consequences. Father won't just let this go." "I'm not afraid of him," Omar said, though the weight of his words felt heavier than he'd expected. Amira hesitated, then stepped closer. "There's something you need to know. Father has already begun making arrangements for your engagement." The revelation hit Omar like a punch to the gut. He stared at her, disbelief etched across his face. "Engagement to whom?" "A family friend's daughter," Amira said reluctantly. "Someone who fits Father's idea of appropriate. He hasn't announced it yet, but it's only a matter of time." Omar's mind raced. His father's actions weren't surprising, but the timing felt deliberate, a calculated move to force him back into line. The thought of being bound to someone he didn't love, to a life he didn't choose, ignited a fire within him. "I won't go through with it," he said firmly. "Not now, not ever." Amira's expression was pained, but she nodded. "Then you need to act quickly. Father is expecting you to fall in line, but if you make your intentions clear, he won't be able to control the narrative." The next morning, Omar returned to the excavation site, his resolve hardened. Sophia greeted him with a mixture of surprise and relief, though the tension in his shoulders didn't escape her notice. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," she said as he joined her near one of the pits. "Something like that," Omar replied, forcing a faint smile. "But I came here to focus on what matters." Sophia studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good, because we've made some progress, and I think you'll want to see this." She led him to a section of the site where her team had unearthed an ornate chest, its edges adorned with intricate carvings. The chest was partially open, revealing fragments of documents inside. Sophia's excitement was palpable as she explained their potential significance. "These could be trade records, maybe even letters," she said, her voice brimming with energy. "If we can preserve them, they might tell us more about the people who lived here and their connections to the world beyond." Omar knelt beside the chest, his fingers tracing the carvings. For a moment, the weight of his family's expectations faded, replaced by a sense of wonder. "This is incredible," he said softly. "It's like the past is reaching out to us." Sophia smiled, her gaze warm. "Exactly. That's why we do this." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the world around them seemed to fall away. But the moment was interrupted by the sound of the phone ringing. Omar stood, pulling his phone from his pocket. The caller ID showed his father's name. He hesitated, then silenced the call. Sophia watched him, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Everything okay?" Omar nodded, though his jaw tightened. "Just another reminder of what I'm up against." Sophia placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounded. "Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone." Her words lingered as they returned to work, the connection between them growing stronger with each passing moment. Yet in the back of Omar's mind, his father's ultimatum loomed, a shadow threatening to consume everything he had begun to fight for. The heat of the desert was relentless, but the sense of discovery coursing through the excavation site pushed exhaustion to the background. Omar stood with Sophia and her team near the ornate chest they had uncovered the day before. The fragments inside had been carefully extracted overnight, revealing delicate scrolls and brittle pieces of parchment that had survived centuries beneath the sand. Sophia knelt over a table in the main tent, magnifying glass in hand as she examined one of the scrolls. Omar watched her with quiet admiration. Her focus was unwavering, her passion infectious. He couldn't help but feel that her dedication was transforming this desolate site into something profoundly alive. "These markings," Sophia murmured, gesturing for Omar to closer, are unlike anything I've seen before. They look like a combination of early trade symbols and a form of written communication unique to this region. Omar leaned over, careful not to disturb her workspace. The symbols on the parchment were intricate, their patterns weaving together like an ancient tapestry. "What do they say?" he asked, his voice low, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the delicate scroll. "We're still translating," Sophia replied, her excitement tempered by caution. "But from the fragments we've managed to piece together, it seems these might be records of a trade war. There's also mention of a partnership, possibly between two leaders or families." Omar's brow furrowed. "A partnership? Between who?" Sophia set the magnifying glass down and met his gaze. "We're not sure yet, but the context suggests it wasn't purely economic. There's mention of an exchange of gifts. And this phrase here," she pointed to a symbol, "roughly translates to a bond beyond borders. It could imply a union, maybe even a marriage." The air between them grew still as the implications settled in. Omar couldn't ignore the parallels between the ancient story unfolding before them and his own life. The idea of two worlds coming together, despite their differences, resonated deeply with him. Sophia must have noticed his expression, and she asked, "What are you thinking?" Omar hesitated before speaking. "This bond you're describing, it feels like it goes against everything my family believes in. My father sees alliances as transactional, purely about power and control. But this," he gestured to the scroll, "this feels different. It's about connection, something deeper." Sophia nodded, her eyes searching his face. Sometimes history reminds us of what we've forgotten or what we've chosen to ignore. The weight of her words lingered as they continued their work. Sophia's team focused on preserving the fragments, while Omar found himself drawn to the larger story emerging from the ruins. He spent hours studying the artifacts, asking questions, and listening to Sophia's insights. The more he learned, the more he felt a sense of clarity, a growing conviction that his family's rigid worldview was missing something vital. By mid-afternoon, Sophia called Omar over to another table, where a team member had uncovered an engraving on one of the chest's panels. The carving depicted two figures standing side by side, their hands joined in a gesture of unity. Above them, a line of symbols curved like an arch, framing the image. Sophia traced the engraving with her fingertips. "This could be the key to understanding everything else we've found." Omar studied the figures, noting the way their postures seemed to convey equality rather than subservience. "What do you make of it?" he asked. Sophia's voice was thoughtful. "It's a representation of partnership, of two people or groups choosing to work together despite their differences. It's rare to see something like this in ancient carvings. Most of the time, one figure is dominant, symbolizing conquest or control." Omar couldn't help but smile faintly. "Maybe they were ahead of their time. Or maybe," Sophia said, meeting his gaze, "they simply believed in something that others couldn't see." Her words struck a chord, and for a moment, the world outside the tent seemed to fade away. Omar felt a strange sense of kinship with the figures in the engraving. Like them, he was navigating a world of expectations and boundaries, searching for a way to honor his own truth. The moment was interrupted by a commotion outside. One of the workers hurried into the tent, his expression urgent. "Dr. Carter, Sheikh Al-Farid's men are here. They're asking for Omar." Sophia and Omar exchanged a glance before stepping outside. A group of men in traditional robes stood near the edge of the site, their presence imposing. At the front was one of Shaq Abdul's closest advisors, his expression stern. "Omar," the man said, his voice formal, "your father has sent us to bring you back to the palace. He wishes to speak with you immediately." Omar's jaw tightened. He could feel Sophia's eyes on him, her concern evident. "I'll go," he said finally, "but tell my father I have no intention of abandoning this project." The advisor's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something disapproval, perhaps in his gaze. Without another word, the men turned and headed back to their vehicles. Sophia stepped closer, her voice low. "Are you sure about this?" Omar nodded, his resolve unwavering. I need to face him. I can't keep avoiding this. Sophia hesitated, then placed a hand on his arm. Just remember, you're not alone in this. You have allies here and beyond. Her words bolstered him as he climbed into his car, the dust kicking up behind him as he sped toward the palace. The ancient ruins faded in the rearview mirror, but the stories they held remained vivid in his mind. Omar knew that the confrontation ahead would test him in ways he couldn't yet predict, but he also knew he couldn't turn back now. The ruins had spoken, and their message was clear. Some bonds are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The ride back to the palace was tense, the silence inside the car broken only by the faint hum of the engine. Omar stared out at the desert, the ruins still vivid in his mind. The figures from the engraving haunted him, their unity, their defiance of boundaries. He clung to that image as he prepared to face his father once more. The palace gates loomed ahead, their ornate patterns reflecting the last light of day. As the car came to a halt, Omar stepped out and was immediately met by one of his father's advisors. "The sheik is waiting for you in the main study," the man said curtly. Omar nodded, his resolve hardening with every step he took. When he entered the study, Sheikh Abdul Al-Farid stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back. The room, with its walls lined with leather-bound books and heavy drapes, felt oppressive, like a courtroom awaiting its verdict. "You've been making choices that force my hand, Omar," the sheik said without turning. His voice was calm, but carried an edge that Omar recognized all too well. "I've been making choices that align with what I believe is right," Omar replied, standing his ground. His father turned to face him, his expression as unyielding as the desert itself. "And what you believe is right has brought dishonor to this family. Your involvement with that excavation and that woman has made us the subject of gossip. Do you think you can lead this family while chasing childish ideals?" Omar felt his anger rise, but he forced himself to stay calm. "This isn't about gossip, Father. It's about something bigger than us. Those ruins hold stories that connect us to our past, to a time when alliances weren't just about power, but about trust and respect. And what has that trust earned you?" The sheik retorted, his voice rising. "A foreign woman who will never understand our ways? A group of relics that will be forgotten the moment they're placed in a museum? You risk everything for a fantasy." "It's not a fantasy," Omar said firmly. "It's a chance to redefine what our family stands for, to show the world that we honor our heritage, not by hoarding it, but by sharing it." The sheik's expression darkened. "You speak as if you have a choice. Let me make this clear, Omar. You will end your involvement with that excavation, and you will marry the woman I have chosen for you. This discussion is over." Omar's heart pounded, but he met his father's gaze with unwavering defiance. "I won't do it. I won't marry someone I don't love, and I won't abandon something I believe in." The room fell into a heavy silence. For a moment, it seemed as though the air itself had stilled. Then the sheik stepped closer, his voice dangerously low. "If you defy me, you will lose everything. Your inheritance, your position, your name. Think carefully about your next words, Omar." Omar swallowed hard, the weight of his father's ultimatum pressing down on him. But in that moment, the image of the engraving resurfaced in his mind, a reminder of the strength found in unity and defiance. "If that's the price of doing what's right," he said quietly, "then I'll pay it." The sheik's expression shifted, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face before it hardened once more. Without another word, he turned away, his dismissal final. Omar left the study, his chest tight but his step steady. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. Amira was waiting for him in the hall, her face pale. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He disowned me," Omar said, the words bitter but strangely freeing. Amira's eyes widened, but she didn't try to dissuade him. Instead, she reached out and gripped his arm. "You've always been braver than the rest of us, Omar. Bravery comes with a cost." "I know," he said softly, "but this is something I have to do." The next morning, Omar returned to the excavation site, his decision weighing heavily on him, but his resolve unshaken. Sophia greeted him with cautious optimism, her eyes father made his choice, and I've made mine." Sophia hesitated, then nodded. "That couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," Omar admitted, "but I couldn't keep pretending to be someone I'm not." They spent the day immersed in work, the excavation offering a reprieve from the storm raging in Omar's personal life. By mid-afternoon, news of Omar's break from his family began to trickle in. Workers whispered quietly among themselves, their glances sympathetic but respectful. Sophia, however, focused on the task at hand, refusing to let the rumors derail their progress. As the sun began to set, Omar and Sophia stood together near the chest, the desert bathed in hues of orange and gold. "I don't know what comes next," Omar admitted, his voice tinged with both uncertainty and hope. "But I know I can't do it alone." Sophia turned to him, her expression steady. "You don't have to. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Her words grounded him, their connection growing stronger with every passing moment. For the first time in years, Omar felt a sense of purpose, a clarity that transcended the chaos around him. The ruins had given him more than a glimpse into the past. They had revealed a path forward, one that demanded courage, sacrifice, and love. As the desert wind carried the faint whispers of ancient stories, Omar knew that his battle was far from over. But with Sophia by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The days that followed were a wind of uncertainty. Omar's break with his family had sent shockwaves through the community, and the whispers had grown into a storm. Every decision he made, every move he took at the excavation site, was scrutinized and dissected by both supporters and critics alike. But amid the chaos, the excavation became his sanctuary. Each artifact unearthed felt like a small victory, a reminder of why he had chosen this path. The team worked tirelessly, their camaraderie and dedication giving him a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. Sophia noticed the change in him. He was more focused, more engaged, but there was a weight to his presence, a tension that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, as they sat under the shade of the main tent during a break, she decided to address him. "You've been quiet lately," she said, handing him a bottle of water. "More than usual, I mean." Omar took the bottle, his expression thoughtful. "A lot has changed in a short time. I guess I'm still figuring out where I stand." Sophia nodded, her gaze steady. "That's normal, but you're not in this alone, you know. You've got us. You've got me." Her words, though simple, struck a chord. Omar looked at her, his gratitude evident. "You have no idea how much that means to me." Sophia smiled faintly. "I think I do." Their conversation was interrupted by one of the workers calling Sophia over to examine a newly uncovered artifact. Omar watched as she moved with purpose, her passion for the work shining through. It was that passion, that unrelenting drive, that had drawn him to her in the first place. And now, it was what kept him grounded. By the time the sun began to set, the team had made significant progress. A series of inscriptions on a newly uncovered wall hinted at a larger narrative, one that tied together the artifacts they had found so far. The story of a partnership between two leaders, forged through mutual respect and a shared vision, was becoming clearer with each discovery. Sophia and Omar stood together near the wall, their voices low as they discussed the implications of the inscriptions. "It's incredible," Sophia said, tracing the carvings with her fingertips. "This confirms so much about what we've been theorizing. These weren't just trade routes. They were cultural exchanges, relationships built on trust." Omar nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It's ironic, isn't it, that something so ancient can feel so relevant?" Sophia looked at him, her eyes soft. "Sometimes the past has a way of showing us what we've lost sight of." As the stars began to emerge overhead, Omar felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in weeks. But the serenity was short-lived. The next morning, as the team prepared to resume their work, a messenger arrived at the site, carrying news that sent ripples through the camp. The sheikh had called for a public meeting in the city square, where he planned to address the rumors surrounding Omar's break from the family. The message was clear. Sheikh Abdul intended to reclaim control of the narrative, and Omar's choices would be the center of attention. Sophia watched as Omar processed the news, his expression unreadable. Finally, she stepped closer, her voice gentle and firm. "What are you going to do?" Omar took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. "I'll go. If my father wants to put me on trial in front of the city, I won't hide from him." Sophia's eyes searched his face, a mixture of concern and admiration. "Are you sure? You don't have to do this." "I do," Omar said, his voice steady. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about what we're doing here, what it means. If I don't stand up for it, who will?" The next day, the city square was packed with onlookers. The tension in the air was palpable as Omar arrived, his presence drawing murmurs from the crowd. He stood tall, his posture composed, but his heart raced as he spotted his father standing on a raised platform, flanked by advisors and supporters. When the sheikh began to speak, his voice carried the weight of authority. He painted a picture of a family divided, of a son who'd strayed from his responsibilities. The crowd listened intently, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to skeptical. When it was Omar's turn to speak, he stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the gathered crowd. "My father speaks of loyalty," he began, his voice clear, "of duty and tradition. And he's right, those things matter. But loyalty is not blind, and tradition is not unchanging." The crowd murmured, their attention riveted. "What we're doing at the excavation isn't a betrayal of our heritage," Omar continued. "It's a celebration of it. We're uncovering stories that remind us of who we are, stories that connect us to something greater than ourselves. And I believe that honoring those stories is the greatest duty of all." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I won't apologize for the choices I've made, because they've been made with purpose. If that means I lose my place in this family, so be it. But I refuse to lose myself." The square was silent for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the crowd. It was hesitant at first, but it grew, spreading like wildfire. Omar's chest swelled with a mix of relief and gratitude. As the crowd dispersed, Omar caught sight of his father. Their eyes met across the square, and for a moment, the sheikh's expression softened, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Omar to stand in the aftermath of his stand. Sophia appeared at his side, her presence a steadying force. "You were incredible," she said softly. Omar exhaled, the tension finally leaving his body. "It's not over," he said, "but it's a start." Sophia smiled, her hand brushing against his. "It's more than that. It's a step towards something better." As they left the square together, Omar felt a sense of hope blooming within him. The road ahead would be difficult, but he wasn't walking it alone. And for the first time in his life, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The aftermath of Omar's public stand rippled through the city like a storm. News of his speech spread quickly, and reactions were divided. Some praised his courage, seeing him as a bridge between the past and the future. Others whispered of betrayal, their loyalty to Sheikh Abdul unshaken. Despite the polarization, Omar found himself feeling lighter, as though a weight he had carried his entire life had finally been lifted. At the excavation site, the team worked with renewed energy. The inscriptions and artifacts they had uncovered were coming together into a cohesive narrative, each piece revealing more about the partnership that had shaped the ancient trade routes. For Sophia, the discoveries were monumental, a career-defining breakthrough. For Omar, they were something more, a reminder that unity and shared purpose could transcend even the deepest divides. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Sophia found Omar standing near the edge of the ruins. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, his expression contemplative. "Lost in thought again?" she asked, joining him. Omar smiled faintly, something like that. "I've been thinking about what comes next." Sophia tilted her head, studying him. And I don't know," he admitted. "I've spent so much of my life trying to meet expectations, to live up to what my family wanted for me. Now that I've stepped away from all of that, it's uncharted territory." She nodded, her tone thoughtful. Uncharted territory can be scary, but it can also be exciting. You get to decide where you go from here. Omar turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. I know one thing for certain. I want to see this project through to finish what we've started. It feels like the first thing in my life that's truly mine. Sophia smiled, her warmth grounding in. Then we'll finish it. Together. Their connection had deepened in the weeks since Omar's break from his family, but neither of them had rushed to define it. There was a quiet understanding between them, a mutual respect that had grown into something undeniable. As they stood there in the fading light, it was clear that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The next morning, an unexpected visitor arrived at the excavation site. Amira stepped out in a sleek black car, her expression a mix of determination and nervousness. Omar was surprised to see her, quickly walked over to greet her. Amira, he said, his voice filled with curiosity. What are you doing here? I came to talk, she replied, and to see what's been causing all this commotion. Sophia approached, her curiosity evident. Omar introduced the two women, and though Amira's demeanor was polite, her focus remained on her brother. They walked a short distance from the main site, finding a quiet spot to talk. Father is furious, Amira began, her voice low. But he's also conflicted. Your speech, it made an impact, even if he won't admit it. Omar's brow furrowed. I didn't give that speech for him. I know, Amira said, but it forced him to see you in a new light. He's been questioning whether he underestimated you. Omar crossed his arms, his voice steady. It doesn't change the fact that he disowned me. Amira hesitated, then sighed. No, it doesn't, but it means the door isn't completely closed. He won't say it outright, but I think he's waiting for you to take the first step. Omar shook his head. If he wants reconciliation, it has to be on equal terms. I won't go back to being his puppet. Amira smiled faintly. You always were the stubborn one. They talked for a while longer, their conversation tinged with the complexities of loyalty and love. Before leaving, Amira placed a hand on Omar's shoulder. Whatever happens, just know that I'm proud of you. You've become the man I always knew you could be. Her words stayed with Omar long after she left. That evening, as he worked alongside Sophia to catalog the latest artifacts, he felt a sense of clarity beginning to emerge. His father's approval no longer held the power it once did, but the possibility of finding common ground felt less like surrender and more like progress. A week later, the excavation reached its climax. The team uncovered a large chamber buried beneath the ruins, its walls adorned with intricate carvings that depicted the full story of the ancient partnership. It was a tale of two leaders, one a merchant, the other a tribal chief who had forged an alliance through trust and mutual respect. Their union had brought prosperity to their people, and their legacy had endured for centuries. As Sophia presented the findings to a group of historians and cultural leaders, Omar watched from the sidelines, his heart swelling with pride. This was what he had fought for, a chance to honor the past while building a future that embraced its lessons. After the presentation, Sophia found Omar sitting alone in one of the tents, a rare moment of quiet amid the excitement. She sat beside him, her expression thoughtful. You did it, she said softly. We did it, Omar corrected, his smile gentle. None of this would have been possible without you. Sophia's cheeks flushed, but she held his gaze. It gave this project something it was missing: heart, purpose, a connection to something bigger. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had accomplished settling over them. Finally, Omar spoke. I've been thinking about my father. Sophia nodded, encouraging him to continue. I don't know if he'll ever fully accept the choices I've made, Omar said, but I think it's worth trying to find common ground. Not for his sake, but for mine. Sophia smiled. That sounds like a good place to start. A few days later, Omar returned to the palace for the first time since his break with the family. The meeting with his father was tense but civil, both men wary but willing to engage. Though no grand reconciliation was reached, there was a sense of understanding beginning to form, a recognition that change was inevitable, and that it didn't have to mean the end of everything. The excavation concluded with a grand unveiling. The artifacts and inscriptions displayed in a cultural center that celebrated the region's history. Omar stood beside Sophia as they cut the ribbon, the applause of the crowd ringing in his ears. For the first time in his life, he felt truly at peace, not because he had all the answers, but because he was finally asking the right questions. As the sun set over the desert that evening, Omar and Sophia stood together, the ruins behind them and the future ahead. The journey had been anything but easy, but it had brought them to this moment, a new beginning forged from love, courage, and a shared vision.